Ladies and gents, welcome to the very first episode of the Carlyle podcast. I'm your host, Max Carlyle. Bit of background on myself and how the podcast came to be. I'm in my final year of football business and media at UCFB's Etihad campus, which is a provider of an executive education in the global sports industry. I entered UCFB's entrepreneur competition in my second year and pitched the idea to the board of marketing a sports education crossover podcast to their publics and potential students. I was successful in my pitch, and I owe an awful lot to the chairman, Brendan Flood, and the board who showed faith and invested in me to host my very own podcast after several years of building experience in the media industry. Another member of the board who was there to judge me pitch and is the podcast's very first guest, a man who I draw a great source of motivation from, cracking player, even better bloke, and he encouraged me, as I said, a lot to get out there, do as much as I can and get this podcast on the market. So I look forward to the ride and I hope you do too. Without further ado, getting on with the first podcast. The podcast's first guest really is a footballing great, amassing over 400 appearances for Bolton, Burnley and Blackpool, as well as England under-23s. After his playing career, he expressed a keen interest in the business behind the game. He has negotiated over 100 million in sponsorship agreements as the CEO behind the construction of Huddersfield Town, John Smith Stadium, Bolton's Reebok Stadium and Coventry's Ricoh Arena. Commercial director behind the new Wembley with projects worldwide. He was awarded an MBE for his services to football in 2007 before co-founding the world's first football university. Please welcome Paul Fletcher, joining me now from the Etihad campus. Paul, first and foremost, I've got to say thank you for your time and agreeing to be the podcast's first guest.
Max, this is my pleasure to be here at the Etihad, this wonderful new stadium where we have our university, UCFB, going so well, both here and at Wembley. I'm pretty pleased the way things are going at present. All we need now is Manchester United to win a few games and things will be a lot better in this in this city.
Of course, and first and foremost, Paul, I've got to ask, I've heard of a sociologist, I've heard of a psychologist. Can you please tell me where the term stadiologist comes from?
Well, it's quite good, yeah. Somebody called me a stadiologist and I had to ask the same question. I said, why am I a stadiologist? He said, well, you've done more than one football stadium. So normally, in my role, which is the chief exec of the project, the chief exec of the club goes ahead and builds the stadium, whether it be a new stadium at Leicester or at Brighton or wherever they are. They stay there with the club because they're on the board. I've had the good fortune or bad fortune to be involved in the building of 4 major stadiums where I've taken control as chief executive. So the fact that I've done more than one, somebody's called me a stadiologist. That's the best explanation I can give you.
Surely a world first. First and foremost, obviously the theme of this podcast will be stadiums in and of themselves, but first a few kind of quick fire questions, if you will. As I said, I could sit here and talk football all day with someone like yourself, but just a few quick ones. Firstly, who was the best player that you played with?
It's quite a good question. I've given that a little bit of thought. I had the good fortune when I was a 70-year-old kid of making my debut for Bolton Wanderers, and they had an elder player, a retiring Liverpool player, Roger Hunt, who within a few years of that had won the World Cup. So there's me, a young kid, playing alongside a World Cup winning player. And Roger was special because not only was he a great footballer, he was quite a gentleman and a lovely guy. Great goal scorer. It was nice to watch him at the end of his career. Obviously I'd seen him there playing for England many times, but to be alongside him as a young kid, wearing the same shirt, a Bolton Wanderers shirt as Roger Hunt was wearing, and obviously an ex-Liverpool player, that was a big thrill.
Of course, and on the flip side to that coin, best player that you've played against?
Without any shadow of a doubt, and many people of my era in the 70s will answer the same question, George Best was phenomenal. He was probably he didn't know what he was doing half the time because he did it all on instinct.
Yeah.
I'm sure he used to do a little bit of training every now and then. He used to have a bit of a history of himself off the field, but on the field, he was magical. That was probably the best way to describe him. And I've never seen anybody like him since.
Huge compliment. Relevant given the topics that we're going to go on to discuss, but the best ground that you played at?
Oh boy. In my day, the grounds were quite different because we didn't have the pitch technology we have now. Now we need wonderful green, fabulous pitches, not for the players, for television. That's why. Many years ago, you used to get a big diamond in the middle of the pitch, where the pitch got worn away during the winter months, so it was a different type of surface. But the best ground, right at the very end of my days, I played at the old Wembley Stadium. And that was the best ground I'd ever played on. I wish I could have played at the new Wembley Stadium, but I had a game on the old Wembley Stadium. By far, the pitch was perfect at that time.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I was going to say, as the commercial director
of
the new Wembley.
And Max, what a thrill it was for me to play on this old ground, and then it was one of my responsibilities to go and knock it down and help build the new one. So that was a thrill. Even though I never got there as a player, with Burnley we got into the semi-final of the FA Cup in '74. Never got any further than the semi-final. Never got there to Wembley. So it was can I say it was a thrill to go and knock down the old stadium? No, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, and I would have asked what was the best goal that you've ever scored, but I think we both know the answer to that one. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, 1974 against Leeds at Ellen Road, overhead kick, one of the finest overhead kicks you're ever going to see in world football. Be sure to check it out.
Yeah, on YouTube.
Of course, it's there.
I can tell people listening, of all my time in football, which is 20 odd years, I've never ever done an overhead kick in my life. And I did one on one occasion, and the ball flew in.
Very acrobatic.
Never. It was just instinct. Like we talk about George Best playing under instinct. A moment in time, it just happened. And even to this day, I get stopped in the street in Burnley, and somebody will say, "I was at that game when that goal was scored." So it's a big thrill for me.
Fantastic. And as someone who's studied international football business as a module while at my time at UCFB, I'd just like to ask, have you always had this business acumen?
No, I don't think I have a business acumen. What I have is an ability to keep turning up. I don't let anything sort of sway me from if I have a goal. So during my career, when I got to the age of about 25, 26, 27, I was very conscious. I have a wife and a couple of young kids. I thought, what am I going to do after this? It's naturally going to end in my mid-30s. In the end, it ended when I was 31. So I was always planning what I could do. I opened a printing business, and my father was a printer, so I bought an old Heidelberg Platten printing machine, and we used to print business cards and stationery. And then I had a furniture removal business. I had an advertising agency. I had a kitchen centre in the centre of Burnley when I was a Burnley player. So I'd always been interested, and what I did, and this is been quite good for me, every one of the businesses I had failed. But the most important thing about having a business and it failing is bouncing back, not letting it bother you. So I made all my mistakes rather than when I'd retired from football. I made them all while I was still playing football and I was earning a good wage. And I learned from those mistakes when I moved into some more serious business afterwards. So, I was never the best printer. I was never the best provider for kitchen furniture. But I just stuck at it. And even to this day, if I'm good at one thing, I'm good at sticking at a problem and solving it. So
the saying rings true, there's no such thing as losses, only lessons.
Exactly, and that's what it was to me, and sometimes, I don't say this enviously, looking at the current players now, who are all multimillionaires almost, they still have to provide something, what they're going to do, between them being 33-year-old and probably these guys 73, 74, they're going to, that is 40 odd years, and it's okay having lots of money, but To me, that's not the thrill. The journey is the thrill. The journey of learning and piecing something together and being successful in something else that's not football is part of the journey that I was very keen to do.
Something really interesting from your perspective that came out to me was UCFB as a whole. So you were talking about journeys, your journey as a co-founder of UCFB. The use of sports facilities on a non-match day, which is what I gleaned from you. From my perspective, I see this as football using its soft power to provide education, which I think is absolutely fantastic. But from that aspect of the use of sporting facilities on a non-match day, how did that journey go for you, venturing in and transitioning as a co-founder of UCFB?
At the end of my career, I wanted to stay in the game. I didn't want to be a manager or a coach or a trainer or a physiotherapist, but I could see the commercialism starting to develop in football. And this is good advice for all UCFB students out there. I started right at the bottom at a non-league football club. We used to get about 250 spectators every week. Colne Dynamos, little club. But that's where I learned. I learned about how you pay the referee. I learned about how you mow the pitch. I learned about how you put the white lines down and who cleans the goalposts and every job that needed doing. I had to edit the programme. I did everything, and it's great experience. And then Huddersfield Town commercial manager left, and I got offered the job. So I was at Huddersfield Town, and I was absolutely loving it. My job was to sell the golf days, and I had to sell perimeter advertising. I had to get sponsored cars for the players. I couldn't wait to get to work in the morning. I loved every minute of it. And then the chairman came in one day and he said, "We're building a new stadium and it's your job to build us the new stadium." And I said, "I don't know anything about stadia." He said, "Well, neither does any of us, so you're going to have to be the person doing it for us." So that was Graham Leslie, who was chairman of Huddersfield Town at the time. So I got dumped in this job I didn't want to do of heading a brand new stadium, which I knew nothing at all about.
The conversation that we're about to have is essentially going to be broken down into 4 discussion points. Firstly, the early days of football spectatorship. Secondly, stadium disasters, particularly around the era of the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Thirdly, the new stadiums coming to light in the UK domestically. And finally, stadiums of the future. To start, the early days of football spectatorship. Essentially, I think it's in a way any individual views sport as such as it has the ability to bring people together to watch. There's a public demand for that spectacle of 22 players on a field given their all. I know one of the examples that you highlighted to me was the Rome Colosseum. Be it team sport or blood sport, the demand is always there. An example that I'm a huge fan of is the Christmas Truce, 1914, given the fact that opposing forces would leave the trenches and hop onto no man's land and have a game of football on Christmas Day. That uniting factor. Just explain, how does that process begin of evolving a crowd to organise, to get them to obediently observe a game without interference?
Yeah, well, I think, if you look at your history, the early days it was the Greeks and then it was the Romans, and they used to have these stadiums, we got arenas, we got hippodromes, we've got theatres, all based on having a group of people who want to see a competition. Now, in the early days in Greece, it was the Olympics, and then you had maybe in Rome you had the battles that used to take place, and I was fascinated when I went out to see the Colosseum in Rome. I didn't know they used to have naval battles. They used to fill the Colosseum with water and to have naval battles. You can't believe it, can you? And this is hundreds of years ago. So, you can trace back the ability to have a venue and people want to watch a type of fight go on, whether it be a men fighting against animals or whether it be a basketball match or a football match. People like to watch a competition going on. So I think those are the early days of stadia. And the actual word stadium, I'm told, comes from a Latin word which describes sand, because they always used to fill the Colosseums with sand so that it would mop up the blood.
Okay.
So that's how, when you start tracing it back, it gets quite interesting. Probably that you can trace stadiums back 4,000 years. It's quite frightening, really. But we have to move on. I mean, I would like to start thinking about the early football stadiums, maybe in the early 20s, 30s, 40s. that's where I started to get a real interest in these fascinating buildings.
Yeah, of course. We turn our stance to England and Britain in particular.
Yeah.
From, I'd say, 1888, the formation of the Football League, it went a long way to helping form football as a fully fledged profession.
Yeah.
If you look at the founders of the Football League, just to reel them off, Accrington, Everton, Aston Villa, Stoke, Bury, Bolton, Burnley, Notts County, Derby, West Brom and Wolverhampton Wanderers, all a northern contingent.
Yeah, most of them still there. Sadly, Bury have just dropped away. Accrington managed to crawl back in. So yes, this is where it all started, and probably it was the coal mines, the cotton mills, the industry, the Industrial Revolution, and all that era, where the mill owners wanted to have something for the people who worked in the mills to watch on the weekend. So the mill owners who started off the football fields, and the people who worked in the mills, and often the people who worked in the mills would be the players as well. So the competitions would be against Bolton, would have the competition against Bury and against Blackburn, and it stayed local, and then it started to turn into a national league. So it's a very brief history of football. It's far more detailed than that, but there is a desire for wanting your team to win, whoever it is, whether it be one person represent or 100 people. You want your team to win, and if you can watch that happen, it sort of passes a Saturday afternoon.
I suppose you could include this in technological advancements, really, is the development of stadiums. And as an Evertonian, I know we've got our fair field of first, one of them being the first purpose-built football stadium in England, Goodison Park, in 1892, if I'm not wrong. And obviously that was architected by Archibald Lecht.
Right,
that signature design.
Yeah, fascinating.
In terms, as you mentioned, understanding the roles and responsibilities of different people, how does facility management and game management develop during that time?
Yeah, well, they sort of run hand in hand, because you're constantly wanting your team to win, but there came a moment in time when you could buy a player from another club which would strengthen your side. So then you start to see commercialism, where the trading of players started to get interesting, and then someone had the bright idea of putting perimeter advertising around the ground, so you start to have some other form of commercialism as well. So in the early days, where often they would, like at my club where my granddad took me when I was a 7-year-old kid, Bolton Wanderers, they used to get 60,000 there on a Saturday afternoon, and most of the people used to walk to the game from all around, and it was just on the edge of the town. So football is slowly starting to become quite a big industry, and then if we move it forward to today, it's ended up as the biggest, the most lucrative sports business on the planet. Football is now I think it's the only professional sport that's played in every country of the world.
As you mentioned, the commercialism and development in that sense of the game. When the Abu Dhabi United Group obviously took ownership of Manchester City, Sheikh Mansour, doing his due diligence on the club, when he released his letters to the fans, obviously explaining the research that he'd done, one of the things that was included in that letter was, in business terms, Premiership football is one of the best entertainment products in the world, and we see this as a sound business investment. How many years are we down the line now? 11. That is, it's true.
Yeah, well, Premiership started in 1992, and probably it was correct to break away the top clubs, because it's going to break, in my view, into international leagues soon, and you'll have a world league, and that's where it's going. But it was a very wise investment, and also it plays a big part in the community. My manager, Jimmy Adamson, I remember him very, very clearly. He's saying, look, you have an important duty this afternoon when you run out on that field. He said, it's not about winning or losing. You've got to give it all you've got, because there's a lot of people in this town who don't have as good a life as you guys. They have to work really, really hard, and it will help them get through the week if you win on Saturday, because they will replay it over and over again in the mind. It's so important that you win, not for yourself, not for your own bonus, but for the town you represent. And that sort of stuck with me throughout all my career.
Yeah, to me that's that's sensational man management in terms of
Oh, yeah,
providing
yeah,
motivation for your players.
Yeah,
That's absolutely
and
fantastic.
it did motivate us, and we did have a good team who got together, and we did win games, and we did give it our everything. So, you know, he was a good tactician, was Adamson, but he was also a good psychologist. He could get into your head and make you play probably better than you normally would do under another manager.
Now, to move on, I was lucky enough to be invited to your launch of Saturday Bloody Saturday, which is obviously the book which you co-wrote alongside Alistair Campbell, which, to just give a brief synopsis, tails British football throughout the 70s and 80s. In terms of early problems, one of the questions that I'd just like to raise, do you believe that the issues came as a consequence of the hooligan stereotype during that time period?
No, I don't think... I don't think the hooligans caused the problem, because we still have hooligans today, but we've controlled it. It was the lack of control of the hooligans. And the first major problems in football was nothing to do with hooligans. And let me tell you, and I can admit to this, it was something to do with me. I played a part in one of the early problems. Let me tell you this story. As an apprentice, 16-year-old, I used to love playing golf. And to get away early, me and 3 or 4 of the other apprentices, on a Monday, after there'd been a big game on Saturday, it was our job to clean the stand. Now, the stand in those days were made mainly of wood. Old railway sleepers used to form some of the walkways, and as they got worn away, you get gaps in between them, and we used to put all the paper from the stand, we used to push it down in between the railway sleepers, rather than take it to the tip, which was a couple of 100 yards away. We didn't know in those days that it would cause
So you'd
a
assume
tragedy.
it'd just genuinely be harmless?
We thought we didn't know. There was nobody watching us. There was no safety officer. We were just told to clean the stand, get rid of all the rubbish, and we did get rid of the rubbish, and we pushed it between the floorboards. And of course, what happened at Bradford City a few years later, a cigarette goes in between the floorboards, and obviously some kids over there were doing the same thing as we did, and the place goes up, and 56 people lost their lives at a game of football at Bradford.
The 11th of May 1985, Bradford City, who I think, if I'm not wrong, were celebrating becoming third division champions at the time.
Yeah, it was a nothing game. I can't remember the team they played against, but there was no reason. It was just like, it was
Lincoln City.
Lincoln City, yeah. So it was a nothing game. Neither of the club. It was just a celebration, and it was just the last match of the season. Let's celebrate this, and it didn't for sure celebrate.
Of course, and
terrible tragedy.
It is a terrible tragedy, and the notion that any spectators should leave their home and not come back from a game of football is just absolutely tragic. 15th of April 1989, obviously, FA Cup semi-final weekend, Everton played Norwich City at Villa Park, and the red half of the city had Nottingham Forest at Hillsborough in Sheffield. Obviously, what ensued is one of the biggest tragedies to me of any sports-related incident at all. 96 fatalities due to what happened at the Left Lane end, and investigation into Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield is ongoing, so I'll refrain from making any comment there. But in terms of the development of spectatorship, how it impacted upon legislation has a great deal to do with the Lord Justice Taylor report of 1990. I plan to do my dissertation on ownership in football and the importance of corporate social responsibility. So recently I was reading a text, and an extract from the text really stuck out to me in relation to the Taylor report and the impact that had on the British game. So if you just allow me to read it now. Drawing on recommendations from the Taylor report, Bale 2000 outlines 4 reasons for the changing relationships between football and its communities after the Hillsborough disaster. Firstly, a number of clubs relocated themselves. Secondly, stadiums have become significantly upgraded. Thirdly, multifunctional, thus revenue-generating stadiums are now spread across England. And finally, a growing number of stadium communities have emerged. Football stadiums are symbolic places to change the face of the game and bring it back from boardrooms and committees to the community.
Well, they got it right, the Taylor report. There's one thing you haven't mentioned in there where they got it wrong, where they said we are going to encourage clubs to ground share, where we want two clubs who live near to each other to share one stadium. Everybody in football went, that will never happen. There's no way Bristol City and Bristol Rovers are going. There's no way Liverpool and Everton are going to share a ground. You know, football fans don't want to share, so they got things. But generally, the Taylor reports got things right, and we've had great results. And it led to the new Premiership. Did the Taylor report just because we got the safest grounds and the best grounds in the world. We hadn't been used to what happened at Hillsborough, because I played at Hillsborough years before, but the problem when I look back on Hillsborough, we'd had, as you've just mentioned, vandalism and stupid football fans going onto the pitch, and someone in the wisdom had decided that we were going to have a fence around the pitch. So all grounds had to have a big metal fence around to stop people getting onto the pitch. Now, at Hillsborough, this was okay for Sheffield Wednesday, who play there every week. But when you get a 57,000 crowd, like the massive crowd you get for a semi-final that was regularly played there, it's a different game than when Sheffield Wednesday played there at home. And of course, what the fans couldn't do is break out onto the pitch when there was a crushing at the back. So when there appeared to be too many people getting in at the back, and that caused a crush at the front, and unfortunately they couldn't spill out onto the pitch
due to the fence terraces
because of the fences that were there. So what tended to happen after Hillsborough, certainly all the fences came down, but we didn't seem to have the hooligans. That seemed to go away as well over the next couple of years.
And the European examples, but do you think safe standing is something going forward that can be implemented without any incidents?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it will happen in English football, and I'll tell you why. After the Taylor report, we had to have some legislation where the government got involved and said, look, this is new legislation and this is what happened. And I bet you don't know this, Max. Let me tell you certain things. Do you know that when you sit in a ground, you're only allowed to walk past 13 people? So every block of seats is in 28. If you're the 14th person, so you're 14 at one side and 14 at the other. So if the olden stadiums, before the Taylor report, were all designed to get people in, suddenly you've got a stadium that has to be designed to get people out. So it's the evacuation of the stadium that matters now. So when you're in this 14th seat, you get to the set of steps. The steps have to be a certain width to get people up. You go down something that's called a vomitory, which is normally about 4 steps down into the concourse. So you go through the vomitory, which has to be a certain width to get people out in time. And then you go into a concourse. The concourse has to be a certain width to get people out. And then you have the big exit doors. You come in through a turnstile, but generally you go out through a big exit door, and that has to be a certain width. So there's certain calculations that are made in these new stadiums that if you've got, say, 10,000 people in one stand and there is an emergency, these 10,000 people will be able to get out because all the calculations are done. The trouble with safe standing, probably what you're suggesting now, you put 2 people in one seat. So if you get double the capacity, how are you going to get them out? Because all the calculations have been done for 10,000 people, not 20,000 people. Does that mean you have to? Well, it means you have to widen the seats, widen the terraces, widen the vomitories, widen the concourses. It won't be able to do that. So it's you have to consider it's okay to stand double the amount of people in an area because it creates a great atmosphere, but you have to be very, very careful that they can all evacuate should there be a problem in that area. And they won't be able to follow the guidelines that have been set by, I'm sorry for going into this in all this detail, but they won't be able to follow the guidelines if they can't get out within the 8 minutes that they've got.
No, and this ties us on quite nicely onto the new stadiums within the UK, and obviously, as you mentioned previously, in 1992, the introduction of the Premiership, the whole rebranding process of the governing bodies within the UK, it allowed clubs a certain independence from the FA and the football leagues, Just a little fact for you, the Premier League received £51 million from a season in broadcasting rights between 1992 and 1997, whereas previously the old First Division accumulated 15 million for a whole season. So in terms of that, as you mentioned, that just the commercial value from 1992 of football within Britain just skyrocketed.
Well, it's massive. You know, I was a chief exec at Burnley when we got promoted in 2008, and it was worth about 66 million to the club. And we got promoted a few years later, it was worth 200 million to the club. I don't know the last promotion. It's just gone phenomenal because we have a wonderful, cool climate here. We have the best pitches. We've got the best players, and we attract foreign players from what. Let me see if you agree to this. We attract lots of black players from countries that the warmth stops the game being played at a fast pace, because we have this cool climate. You know, like if me and you were to go over to say Portugal or Spain, we'd be dripping hot, we'd be sweating. We don't enjoy the climate. But you do it the opposite way. Imagine living in a very warm country like Nigeria or wherever. You get Nigerian players over here in the cool climate that we've got with the natural athleticism.
Excel.
And you can see, you know, I remember the first black player being, I think it was in the mid-60s, playing at Leeds United. The very first black player in my time. And now over 50% of black players, and wonderful players they are, because not only are they great footballers, they're phenomenal athletes.
Of course.
And often they've been brought up in very warm countries, and to come to a cool country like we have often makes it easier to be mobile on the pitch.
And the opportunities available for players commercially in terms of sponsorship,
right the way through. And you know, let's look back on the tragedies and disasters and say, well, we have put things right, haven't we? And yes, the legislation has been good, and whether, irrespective of when people don't like standing or don't like seated, we've started to relax that now, where often people are allowed to stand to watch the game at a seat. So that's a concession. That's a right concession. But going back to safe standing, whether that will ever happen, I'm not too sure.
Not so sure.
Yeah.
Over that period of time in particular, and something that I'm particularly fascinated by is sponsorship rights and naming rights, etc. How does that evolve over time? For example, Everton, I don't know if you know, they're obviously in the works of setting up a new stadium on Branley Dock, hoping to have plan and submission done by the end of this year and playing in a new home essentially by 2023. There is a lot of debate, I know, amongst supporters about what's the stadium going to be called. What is the likelihood, do you think, of that being branded by a corporation?
I've done naming rights to maybe 3 stadiums. I've sold naming rights to 4, 5, 6 companies, and some have collapsed and some have pulled out at the last minute, and you have to go out and sell it again. So I'm familiar with naming rights. If you ask me to comment on Everton's relocation, big risk. And the most important thing is that all the fans follow them. And sometimes fans don't follow you. Look at Bolton Wanderers. They moved 8 miles out of town, 8 miles away from Burnley Park. And the reason they moved out there was to compete with Everton, Manchester United, Chelsea, Tottenham. They didn't think they were going to drop 2-3 divisions, and they've not been able to increase the crowd because, in my view, they've moved too far out of town. So Everton have to be very, very careful. Also, it's almost impossible to build one of these buildings and for it to make a profit. The cost of a football stadium now, and you only use it for 2 hours on a Saturday afternoon. And I hear people say, well, what about sportsmen's dinners and what about conferences? It's a drop in the ocean. The cost of a stadium is now hundreds of millions. My early stadiums, 32 million, the next one costs 44 million, but the stadiums now cost 200 million, and it's very hard to get a return on that investment. So good luck to Everton if they are relocating. I'm sure they'll have done all the homework and all the calculations to make sure that they don't move too far out of town, or too far into town.
As you said, it is very hard, such a relocation, and I think a huge example of that was Arsenal relocating to the Emirates in 2006. I mean, you've seen a more modern example, should I say, in Tottenham at the current moment. I think in that season just gone, the 18-19 season where they've reached the Champions League final, they didn't acquire a player, they didn't bring in a player, and I assume a whole lot of that is down to the fact that due to the relocation.
Yeah, there's a good little saying out there in the football stadium business to say it takes you 10 years to recover from a new stadium. You only have to look at Leicester City. Everyone says Leicester, they won the Premiership. Yeah, what about a few years before when they went bankrupt? They literally went bankrupt because they couldn't afford to pay for their new stadium, and it was only 100 yards away from the old Filbert Street. And they got into financial difficulty. They lost everything. The investors lost everything. New owners came in, took it on board, and made a success out of it. So it takes a long while to recover from a new stadium. It doesn't mean if you build a new stadium that'll lead you to success. That doesn't naturally follow.
No, and in terms of obviously the modern technology you can implement now in stadiums, because I know you've got projects worldwide. I know in particular you gave us a lecture on Stadia Arena, which is in India, the multi-purpose of football stadiums now. Do you think that ability and diversity to host different sports, concerts, and the like, do you think that takes away from being the home stadium of a football team, or is it just a necessity given the current climate of trying to accumulate as much as you can?
It's a very difficult conundrum, is whether a club should build a new stadium. At the end of the day, you're only doing it for one reason. The reason you build a new stadium is to make more money, so you can give more money to the manager, you can go out and buy a better team, and you can climb up the league. That's what everybody wants, eventually. Obviously there's safety and things like this to consider. But unfortunately, these buildings now, the cost of the roof, the cost of the seats, the fact you only use them 26 times, it's ludicrous. Can you imagine me and you building a hotel that's a 100-bedroom hotel, and it costs 80, 90, 100 million pounds, and we only use it every other Saturday and Sunday? But that's the investment you put into a football stadium, and there is nothing you can do with it. You can have the odd rock concert, but we have lots of rain over here, and the last thing rock concerts want, summer months, it's a great, if you get a nice summer's evening, it's wonderful. If it rains, the event's off. So we try to multi-use and use rugby on the same pitch. It sort of half works and half doesn't. So it's very complex. The best idea that I've come across in my last 40 years doing these buildings is the pitch. We've got to stop putting the pitch on ground level. We've got to move the pitch up to level 2, level 3. That gives you massive space underneath for car parking, for retail, for shops, for offices, for an abundance of uses, and it also stops turning the stadium into an oasis that after the football match everybody vanishes, and that is one of the problems. So if you can wrap shops all around the ground floor, you have offices all around level 1, you have the pitch up on level 3, it doesn't cost an awful lot more money. You've got car parking, you have all these facilities. That turns a stadium, and I've been working with MasterCard on this for quite a while, it turns a stadium almost for somewhere where you put in the centre of a city for it to expand from.
As you mentioned, this comes back to multi-purpose and use of sport and facilities. And I know this is something that UCFB in particular have their finger on the pulse of due to the global summit that are coming up. There's a trip to Australia to see the Melbourne Cricket Ground in January 2020. We're going to New York in the April of 2020 for the summit at the Red Bull Arena, and there's one at the Mercedes-Benz in Atlanta too in June of 2020. There's the summit in Toronto in Canada at the BMO Field, which is of course the home of Toronto FC. Just talk a little bit about what that process was like in terms of organising these global summits.
Well, yeah, we are. Well, because the product we have is that professional football is played in every country in the world. Every country has the same problem with stadiums, and every country wants bright young people to recruit to come and work in their buildings. When Brendan Flood walked into my office in 2007 and he said, I've had a good idea that I saw in Mexico, there was a football stadium under university and they called it a football university, and it was teaching the university of how to play football. He said, wouldn't it be a good idea if we had a university for young people who could learn about the business side of football, and it would help the football business itself, because to get bright young people coming to work. So that, that's how UCFB started. And when you think about a stadium now, the first thing I would design into a stadium, on one half I would have a university, which you can, because you've got this education, and at the other half I'd have student bedrooms, so the students can actually work in the building, can watch events in the building whilst they're actually living in the building. So this will start to turn our stadiums into businesses that can have a return on the investment, rather than a building that just sits there 6 days out of every 7.
I would say that covers the fourth and final quadrant of the podcast, the stadiums of the future. We kind of touched upon that debate between capacity and revenue. You look at Spurs in their final season at White Hart Lane, they had around 50 million of match day receipts. As we know, as we mentioned, from 1992, the complexion of the flow of money within sport and within football in particular has become a lot more, as I said, complex. And then, as you say, for example, if you look at Arsenal at the Emirates, their gate receipts from that season were almost double. So you can understand, can't you, teams' willingness and clubs' desire to move to these venues that are multi-purpose, that have this ability to host, provide education, to have facilities such as shops and retail opportunities within the current facility.
Football is like no other business, right? If you were to say, I want to put that idea to ASDA, right, as an example. Every ASDA is the same, because every ASDA has learned from the last ASDA. So they widen the doors, they make the car parks easier, they make the delivery easier. They build one and then they improve on it the next one, and then they improve on the next one. So every ASDA gets better, and the best one is the latest one that's opened, right? Football builds a stadium, then it never shares the information with anybody, right? So every football ground is a brand new building. Every football club is different. Every football club does things differently. Where you can have a massive success with Liverpool, it'll be a disaster with Everton. It'll be a great success with Man City, but with Preston North End, so you can't. Even now, I'm so frustrated that the Football League don't have a stadium division where you can go and you can say, look, I want to build a new stadium, what to suggest? And everybody builds their own idea of a new stadium. Now, this Tottenham idea, okay, they've got American money, so it's brought in billions from America. This sliding the pitch in and sliding the pitch out, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if that does. Let me give you a simple reason why I'm not sure about it. The reason they slide the pitch out is because they want to use the building, right? Just do the maths on this. Mm-hmm. So they want to use the building for exhibitions, conferences, NFL, rock, whatever. They've got a different surface there. But the trouble with football is, if you plan a big event on the pitch, like a rock concert, the Ideal Home exhibition, the boat show, if you plan that big event on the pitch, you plan it 2 years out. But the fixtures only come out just before the season starts. So how can you plan a big game, a big event on your pitch that you're going to get 100,000 people there, maybe more, when the fixtures don't come out?
Yeah, it's not far in advance.
Well, they come out in June, don't they? They come out in June and you start playing in July. So that is a massive consequence, and there's nothing you can do about it. So if you want to put on a massive event at the Tottenham Stadium and hire it for a fortnight, you can't do it. So commercialism is complicated. I've come up with this idea called the hamburger stadium. Have I told you about this? No. Right, just picture a hamburger. The bottom bun has to be retail. So you've got retail shops all around the bottom bun, and on top of the retail you've got offices. So people can use the offices in the centre of town. So you've got retail, you get 86 shops around and these are not big shops, these are Starbucks, Greggs Bakery, just wrapped all the way around. Then you need a piazza all the way around so people can walk around and walk into Greggs, and so suddenly you turn this dead stadium into something that's getting a little bit busier, because on this piazza then you've got what you don't put around football stadiums anymore is a car park. You put that car park 250 yards away,
down the road,
because people don't mind walking after a game, because they have a chat and they don't mind. The last thing what they do mind is sitting on the car park waiting for an hour and a half to get off it, because everyone's trying to get. So you remote your car parks, so you have your stadium, your piazza wrapped around with other shops and offices on the outside, and then it turns this building into a real busy place. Now, I've only talked about the bottom bun. The meat in the middle is sport. So you've got football, American football and rugby. That's all you can play on it. You can't play anything else, and we're definitely not having athletics in there. So you've got the bun, you've got the bun at the bottom, you've got the meat in the middle, which is the sport that plays every now and then, and this is the key, the top, education. One end of it a university, the other end student bedrooms. All around here is 2 levels of student bedrooms, so you've got 200 student bedrooms, and all around here is a hotel. So you've got all the necessities to make this building make a profit. Without even games there, it's got a profit, because you add the student bedrooms to the university, to the hotel, to the shops, to the office, and it's buzzing, it's alive. When we talk about Stadium of the Future, that's the key to it. But if you look into the future and say where we're going to be in 5-10 years time, there is a suggestion that our top 5 teams or 10 teams are going to break into a European league, and then you start having this football tourism starting to break in that does become very important, because instead of let's say Man United play against Bournemouth, you drive down, you watch the game, you drive home. When you get football tourism, when you're playing in another country, you'll have 2 or 3 days. You might take your wife and kids with you, or the family might go together, spend 3 or 4 days there, and that then you become tourists, not just for the game, and then you're back home, and vice versa. When Benfica play Man United here, maybe 10,000 fans of Benfica will come over and stay here, and so the big cities will prosper. So football tourism won't be as attractive to the likes of maybe the Burnleys of this world, that don't have the enjoyment that a tourist would expect in a city.
But that, as you say, and just to finish that global appeal is too much commercially in terms of the revenue that it generates. It's just second to none. And as a word of advice to those students, in particular UCFB students, but students who are looking to find an in into the world of football business or sports business as a whole, what advice could you pass down to those looking to get into those corporate/business associated roles? Because it's a very fast-paced work environment that is constantly changing due to the technological advancements.
Some what I think is great advice: go look at these stadiums. Ask to be shown around the stadium, and when you're going around the stadium, don't ask about the good things. Ask about the mistakes. If you were to build a stadium again, what would you do differently? Would you put the car park in differently? Find out, because and I've done this many times when I've done my stadium. Once it's built, you go, I wish we hadn't have done. I wish we had. If only we would put the home team car park in the different place. So you want to find out about the mistake. We've had 31 brand new stadiums out of a league of around about 90 clubs. A third of our clubs are brand new, spanking stadiums. The other 60 are all refurbished stadiums that have wonderful safety guidelines. So we don't only have the best football league on the planet here in the UK, we have the best and the safest stadiums. And the whole world is wanting to know about how our stadiums work. So for our young people here at UCFB, if you get if you get a buzz like I did about these buildings, it's quite easy to find out and go and ask and do your research, and it'll be the next generation who will put the pitch up on level 3 and have all the commercialism and have a hotel at one end and student accommodation at the other and shops wrapped all around and car parking, and that's the next generation that's going. So there are some fabulous opportunities out there, and my only end is said, just don't be deterred. If you want to get involved in this, don't let anything stop you. I didn't, and I didn't have an education like some of our students again at UCFB for sure. So if I can piece a career together working in this business for the last 50 years or so, UCFB students are streets ahead of me.
Well, I certainly hope to do the same, and I'd just like to say I've learned a hell of a lot from this conversation. Paul, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's absolutely my pleasure, and it's my pleasure that you're here. You are the ideal example of someone who's come through UCFB and on the journey through UCFB, and you, believe it or not, you're going to end up a top broadcaster or a top this or a top that. Probably you don't quite know exactly what you're going to be, but because you've got this determination, and because you put on events like this, and because you win competitions like you've won, you are at the top end of UCFB students, and generally you will have a great success in future life.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Paul Fletcher.